Keanu Reeves stood in the break room of the community center, holding a cup of black coffee that tasted like it had been sitting there since morning. The fluorescent lights hummed above his head, casting a pale glow over his worn gray maintenance uniform. He looked like any other guy who showed up early to fix things nobody else wanted to deal with. Brown work boots, faded shirt with a small patch on the left sleeve, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. To the people walking past, he was invisible, just another worker fitting into the background of a busy Thursday morning. But Keanu Reeves wasn't invisible. He was just choosing to be. 3 weeks ago, he received a letter, not an email, not a text message, but an actual handwritten letter that arrived at his home. The envelope was simple, plain, with no return address. Inside was a letter from a woman who signed it with just a first name. "I work at a community center downtown, and I need help from someone who actually cares." He almost threw it away. He got letters like this all the time. Requests, please, stories from strangers. Part of his life as an actor meant receiving messages from people who felt like they knew him, who thought he could solve their problems just because they'd seen him in movies. But something about this letter made him stop. Maybe it was the handwriting, careful and deliberate. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't ask him for money or fame or anything he could easily give. She asked him to listen. The letter described a place where kids came to learn, to dream, to escape from whatever was happening in their homes. A place where young people found mentors and teachers who believed in them. The woman wrote about the magic that happened there. How a kid who was angry when they walked in would leave with paint under their fingernails and a smile on their face. She wrote about programs that changed lives. She wrote with real feeling, the kind of writing that came from someone who actually loved what they did. But then the letter took a turn. The last page was different. Her handwriting became rushed, almost panicked. She wrote about noticing things that didn't add up, money that was supposed to go toward programs but seemed to disappear, equipment and supplies that weren't there even though the budget said they should be. She mentioned that she tried to ask questions, but people wouldn't give her straight answers. They smiled and changed the subject. She said she didn't know who to trust, and she was scared of losing her job if she kept pushing. "I know you probably won't read this," she wrote at the end. "But if you do, and if you're the kind of person who actually cares about things more than you care about looking good, then maybe you could help, not as a celebrity, just as someone who could actually see what's happening here and tell the truth about it." That last part got to him. Not as a celebrity, just as someone who could see. For 2 weeks, Keanu thought about that letter. He read it multiple times. He looked up the community center online. He watched videos of programs happening there. He saw kids laughing, creating art, learning skills, being part of something that mattered. He saw the woman who wrote the letter. Her name was in one of the videos, teaching a class, completely focused on the work. She wasn't looking for attention. She was just doing the work. He made a decision that would have seemed crazy to most people. He decided to go there himself. Not as Keanu Reeves. As nobody. As a man looking for work. Willing to do the things nobody else wanted to do. It took some careful planning. He had a friend contact the center's director about maintenance work. No audition, no fanfare. Just a simple phone call saying he knew a reliable guy looking for part-time work. Someone who was quiet, didn't need much management, and could start immediately. The director agreed without even asking for a real name, just took the phone number and said to have him show up on Thursday. So now, standing in that break room with bitter coffee and a uniform from an online store, Keanu Reeves was truly nobody. He was a maintenance worker. He had a fake ID that said his name was Kevin Mitchell. He had a short work history that checked out because his friend had set up a basic website for a fake company that didn't exist. He had calluses on his hands from the past week of actual work, doing real repairs around the building. He looked tired because he had been tired. He was learning what it felt like to actually do that kind of work, the kind of work that people in fancy jobs never really think about. That first morning, he arrived at 6 a.m, before anyone else showed up. He took a walk through the whole building. There was a youth center with art studios, computers, a small library. There was a room for tutoring. There was a kitchen where they served breakfast to kids before school. Everything was clean but worn. Things had been fixed many times. Walls had been painted and repainted. Furniture had been mended instead of replaced. But there was something else. There was love in this place. It was in the little notes stuck to the wall in the art room, drawings and messages from kids. It was in the way everything was organized carefully, with intention. It was in the fact that someone had planted flowers in the window boxes, even though the paint was peeling around them. Around 8 o'clock, people started arriving. Staff, volunteers, and kids. They didn't pay any attention to the man mopping the hallway. He was part of the scenery now. Safe. Ignored. He watched a young woman walk in carrying a stack of clay containers. She was maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back and a look on her face like she was thinking through a problem. She wore paint-stained clothes and moved like someone who was used to doing 10 things at once. She nodded at a few staff members, but was mostly focused on what she was carrying. She didn't see him mop, but she stepped carefully over the wet floor anyway, respecting the work without thinking about it. Later that day, Keanu learned her name from a schedule posted in the office. Riley. She taught art classes. She worked with teenagers. According to the posted schedule, she was there almost every single day, often staying late. By the end of his first week, Keanu understood why the woman who wrote the letter was worried. He could see the problems now. He was inside the building, moving through it like a ghost, watching and listening. He noticed the director, a man named Vincent, who spent most of his time in the office on the phone, rarely coming out to see the programs. He noticed the way certain conversations stopped when people walked into the room. He noticed that the art studio was missing supplies that the budget said should be there. He noticed that Riley, who was clearly giving everything to her students, had to work around broken equipment and limited resources. More than that, he was beginning to understand something bigger. This wasn't just a place where people worked. It was a place where kids who didn't have much else had somewhere safe to go. It was a place where an adult believed in them. And someone was stealing that. Someone was making sure that these kids didn't get what they were supposed to get. Keanu finished his coffee and threw the cup away. He had work to do, real work, the kind that would take time and patience and a willingness to see what nobody wanted to see. He was ready for that now to be why the fourth week. Keanu had become part of the furniture. Nobody questioned him anymore. The staff would greet him with a nod in the mornings, ask him to fix something, then forget about him the moment he left the room. This invisibility was exactly what he needed. He could move through the building without drawing attention, could listen to conversations people wouldn't normally have around a stranger, could observe the real mechanics of how this place actually worked. He spent his lunch breaks differently than he expected. Instead of sitting in the break room alone, he started eating in the small kitchen where the younger staff members hung out. There was a woman there named Dorothy, the bookkeeper. She was probably in her mid-50s, with tired eyes and the kind of posture that came from sitting at a desk for too many hours. She brought her lunch in a plastic container every single day, and she would heat it up in a microwave while scrolling through her phone with the kind of exhaustion that suggested she'd been doing this for a very long time. One afternoon, Keanu sat across from her and just started talking about nothing important. He asked her how long she'd been working at the center. She told him 15 years. 15 years of showing up early and staying late. He could see it in her face. He asked her if she liked the work, and she smiled, but it was a tired smile. "The work is good," she said. "The people, most of them are good too. But something's been bothering me lately." That's when Keanu learned to listen in a different way. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there with his sandwich, and Dorothy started talking. She talked about numbers not matching up. She talked about money that was supposed to go one place ending up somewhere else. She talked about trying to ask Vincent, the director, about discrepancies she'd found, and how he would smile and tell her not to worry about things that were above her pay grade. "I'm just the bookkeeper," she said. "I shouldn't be questioning the director, but I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know what things are supposed to look like, and this doesn't look right." Keanu listened, asked her what kinds of discrepancies, and Dorothy started opening up like someone who had been holding this worry inside for months. She told him about grant money that came in for specific programs, but didn't seem to show up in program expenses. She told him about supplies purchased through vendors at prices that seemed way too high. She told him about administrative costs that grew bigger every year, while the actual programs got smaller budgets. "I brought it up to Vincent once," she said. "I asked him directly why the number seemed off, and he got this look on his face. He was nice about it, but he made it very clear that I should mind my own business. He said the board oversaw those decisions, and I should trust them. Do you trust them? Keanu asked. Dorothy didn't answer right away. She looked at her food. I don't know, but I know what I see in the spreadsheets, and what I see doesn't make sense. That conversation changed everything for Keanu. He wasn't just looking at a place where things might be slightly off. He was looking at someone deliberately hiding something. You don't shut down a bookkeeper's questions unless you have something to hide. Over the next 2 weeks, Keanu started paying attention to different things. He noticed that Vincent had a pattern. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, he would close his office door for about an hour. Keanu would happen to be working in the hallway outside, mopping or fixing something, and he would listen. Vincent's voice would get quiet, like he was talking about things he didn't want anyone to hear. Keanu heard him mention numbers. He heard him mention the conversion project. He heard him say things like, nobody has to know, and the books are clean. The more Keanu listened, the more a picture started forming in his mind. This wasn't just casual corruption or someone cutting corners. This was organized. This was planned. One day, he overheard Vincent talking about a real estate deal. Something about converting part of the building into apartments. Something about how the center didn't need all this space anymore, not with the way programs were being cut. Vincent was talking about profit margins and development costs, and how they could move the youth programs to a smaller space and still call it progress. Keanu's chest got tight listening to that. They were planning to shrink the programs. They were planning to make this place smaller, so they could make money off the building itself. He started spending more time in the storage room in the basement. It was where old files were kept, boxes of documents from previous years. The storage room was cold and damp, and nobody ever went down there. Perfect for someone who wanted to look at things without being noticed. He would spend his breaks down there, opening boxes carefully, photographing pages with his phone, putting everything back exactly as it was. The financial records from 5 years ago told a story of a center that used to serve way more kids, a story of programs that used to exist and were slowly eliminated, a story of budgets that got cut while administrative costs stayed the same or grew. And when he cross-referenced those old records with what Dorothy had mentioned, patterns became clear. Grant money that was supposed to fund programs was being reclassified as administrative overhead. Supplies were being purchased through companies with names that sounded official, but when you look closer, seemed to be connected to board members. One afternoon, Keanu was fixing a broken pipe in the storage room when he found something almost by accident, a box that was labeled 2022 Financial Records Archive. Inside were documents that hadn't been properly filed, expense reports, board meeting minutes, and something else, a letter from a grant organization asking Vincent to explain why program funds hadn't been spent on programs. The letter said they would be sending an auditor unless they got a clear explanation, and underneath the letter, in Vincent's handwriting, was a note that said, "Do not respond. Wait it out. They won't follow up." Keanu photographed everything. His hands were shaking slightly as he did it. The next day, he deliberately ran into Riley, the art teacher, as she was leaving the building. She was carrying a bag of art supplies that looked like she'd bought them herself. He knew this because he'd learned that the art program supply budget was less than $2,000 a year, and Riley was teaching classes to over 80 kids. "How's the pottery class going?" he asked, making conversation like a co-worker would. Riley smiled, and it was a real smile, not tired the way Vincent's smiles were. "It's good. The kids are working on hand-building techniques this week. We're making sculptures. It's not perfect because the clay kiln is from like 1995, and it breaks constantly, but the kids don't care. They just love being here and making something." Keanu watched her face as she talked about this. She genuinely loved it. She wasn't doing this for money or recognition. She was doing it because she believed in these kids. "You ever think about working somewhere else?" he asked. "Somewhere with better equipment and more resources?" Riley looked at him like that was a strange question. "I could make more money somewhere else, sure, but I wouldn't be doing this kind of work. These kids come in here carrying stuff from their lives. Broken homes, no money, people telling them they don't matter. And they come into my class, and they make something beautiful with their hands. They see that they can create something. That matters more to me than money or better equipment. Keanu nodded. He understood now. This place wasn't just a job to people like Riley. It was a calling, and that made what Vincent was doing even worse. It made it feel like a betrayal. That night, sitting alone in his small apartment, Keanu went through all the photographs he'd taken, the numbers, the hidden documents, the evidence of funds disappearing, the plans to shrink programs while profiting from the building. He had found what he came looking for. Now came the harder part, figuring out what to do about it. The moment came on a Tuesday morning, and it came without warning. Keanu was fixing a loose outlet in the hallway when a young boy walked in with bruises on his arm and a black eye that was already swelling. His name was Thomas, and he was maybe 9 years old. He was one of Riley's students, a quiet kid who usually came to the art program 3 days a week. Riley was working at the front desk that morning, checking kids in, and when she saw Thomas, something shifted in her face. Keanu saw it from across the room. He watched as she guided Thomas into a private space, closed the door, and started asking him gentle questions. Even from a distance, Keanu could hear the concern in her voice. He pretended to work on the outlet, but he was listening. He heard Thomas say that his mom's boyfriend hit him. He heard Thomas say that his mom works 2 jobs and doesn't know what happened. He heard the fear in a 9-year-old's voice when he talked about going home. Riley called someone. Keanu heard her explain the situation to what sounded like a counselor or social worker. But then he heard something else. He heard Riley's voice change. She was being told that there was a waiting list. She was being told that the center didn't have resources to help. She was being told that this wasn't really the center's responsibility. When Riley came out of that room, she looked defeated. Not angry, just defeated. She looked like someone who wanted to help and had just been told she couldn't. That's when something crystallized in Keanu. This wasn't just about money or fraud or corruption anymore. This was about a real kid with real bruises who needed real help, and that help wasn't coming because money that was supposed to be there had been stolen. He knew, from the documents he'd photographed, that the center used to have a youth counselor position, someone whose job it was to help kids in exactly Thomas's situation. That position had been eliminated 3 years ago. The budget line showed it clearly. Youth counselor position, $40,000 annually. Cut to save money. Keanu had also found the expense report from that same year. $40,000 had been classified as a consulting fee paid to Vincent. No services listed. Just the money gone, transferred. A 9-year-old boy with a black eye needed a counselor that the center couldn't afford because the director had taken the money for himself. That afternoon, Keanu did something he'd been planning to do but hadn't had the right moment for yet. He reached out to someone he knew, a journalist named Patricia, who worked for the local newspaper. They had crossed paths years ago at an event, and he'd always remembered her as someone who cared about getting stories right, about giving voice to people who didn't have power. He arranged to meet her at a coffee shop far enough away from the center that nobody would notice. He brought a folder with him. Inside were copies of the documents he'd photographed, financial records, board meeting minutes, expense reports, the letter from the grant organization that had been ignored, everything. Patricia looked through the documents for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked up at him. "This is real," she asked. "It's real," Keanu said. "I've been working there for a month. This is what I found." "Who are you?" Patricia asked. "Why are you bringing this to me?" "I'm someone who showed up and paid attention," Keanu said. "There's a teacher there who's giving everything to kids who don't have much. There are programs that should exist, but don't because the money disappeared. There's a 9-year-old kid who got hurt, and the center can't afford to help him because the funding got stolen." Patricia listened to him talk. She didn't take notes. She just listened, and then she said something that mattered. "I need to verify this independently. I can't just take your word for it, even if these documents look legitimate. But if this checks out, this is a big story." "I know," Keanu said. "That's why I brought it to you." Over the next week, Keanu lived 2 separate lives. By day, he was still Kevin Mitchell, the invisible maintenance worker. He mopped floors and fixed pipes and listened to Dorothy talk about the anxiety that was keeping her up at night. He watched Riley work with her students, watched her stretch a tiny budget to try to meet impossible needs. He watched Vincent come and go from his office, always on the phone, always looking important. But at night, he worked with Patricia. He helped her navigate the documents. He answered her questions about what he'd seen and heard. He connected her with Dorothy, who was terrified but also relieved to finally tell someone in authority what she'd noticed. Patricia moved quickly. She called the grant organization, whose letter Vincent had ignored. She got confirmation that funds had indeed been misused. She called the state nonprofit oversight board. She started making phone calls to board members, asking careful questions, watching what they said and didn't say. By Thursday of that week, Patricia had enough for a story, but before she ran it, she did something that Keanu had asked her to do. She called Riley and asked if she had time for an interview. Riley agreed, thinking it was about the programs at the center, thinking it was a puff piece about the good work they were doing. Instead, Patricia told her everything. She told her about the fraud. She told her about the stolen money. She told her about the counselor position that should exist but didn't. She told her that Thomas's situation, the black eye, the need for help, could have been handled better if the resources had been there instead of being taken. Riley cried. Keanu heard about this later from Patricia. Riley cried because she'd known something was wrong, and finding out that it was real, that it was as bad as she'd suspected, broke something in her. But Riley also became Patricia's source. On the record, willing to talk about what she'd seen, willing to put her name and her face to the story, even though she knew it meant Vincent would know exactly who had helped bring this forward. Sunday morning, the headline went live. Nonprofit center director accused of $1 million fraud. How community programs were underfunded while director enriched himself. The article was detailed. It had numbers. It had quotes from Dorothy and Riley. It had documentation of the stolen money. It had information about the programs that had been cut, the kids who were affected, the counselor position that should have been there to help someone like Thomas. By Monday afternoon, Vincent had been arrested. Keanu heard about it on his phone while he was at the center, still pretending to be a maintenance worker. He saw the police cars arrive. He watched as Vincent was let out of the building in handcuffs. He saw the looks on the faces of the other staff members, the shock, the confusion, the slow realization of what had been happening right under their noses. Riley saw him standing in the hallway, and something made her really look at him, really look at his face, without the cap hiding his features. Her eyes changed. She saw something familiar, but not enough. Not yet. She was too overwhelmed with everything else. That night, the board called an emergency meeting. Keanu wasn't supposed to be there, but he came anyway. He stood in the back of the room, still in his work clothes, watching as the board members tried to figure out what to do. They were shocked. They said they'd had no idea. They said Vincent had assured them the books were clean. Dorothy stood up and said something that Keanu would remember for a long time. She said, "I tried to tell people something was wrong. I asked questions, and I was told to mind my business. I'm sorry I didn't do more. I'm sorry I let it continue as long as it did." Nobody blamed her. Everyone understood that she'd done the best she could in a position where she had no real power. But someone needed to be blamed. Someone needed to take responsibility. And that someone had been walking through that building every single day, stealing from the children who came there to find safety. Now, he was in a cell instead. And the building, for the first time in years, had a chance to actually heal. Keanu drove home that night and sat in his apartment looking at the news coverage. His name wasn't mentioned anywhere. The documents had come from an anonymous source. Patricia had written. The investigation had been triggered by a concerned employee raising red flags. The story was about fraud and corruption and how it affects real people. Nobody knew it was him. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Because the real story wasn't about a movie star playing detective. The real story was about a place that was going to get a second chance. It was about Riley, who was going to finally have resources to match her passion. It was about Thomas, who was going to get the counselor he needed. It was about Dorothy, who was going to be able to sleep at night. That was a story that mattered. The week after the news broke was chaos. The board held emergency meetings. State investigators showed up. News crews parked outside the building. Parents came to pick up their kids early, worried, confused, trying to understand what had happened. But underneath all that noise, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something more real. Keanu kept showing up to work. He still had 2 weeks left on his part-time contract, and he wasn't going to abandon that now. The center needed stability, and if he could provide it by just continuing to do his job, then that's what he would do. Besides, he wanted to see what came next. The interim director was a woman named Patricia, no relation to the journalist, who had been a board member for years. She was overwhelmed, but she was trying. She wanted to fix things. She brought in an auditor to look at the books. She started having conversations with staff about what had really been going on, about what they'd noticed but were too afraid to say. Riley was different after the story broke. She looked lighter somehow, like something heavy had been lifted off her shoulders. But she also looked tired in a different way. The way someone looks after they've done something hard and right, but costly. One afternoon, Keanu was in the art studio fixing a broken shelving unit when Riley came in with a box of new art supplies. Real supplies, paint sets, quality paper, clay in bulk. She was unpacking them carefully, arranging them on the new shelves he'd installed. Director approved a new budget, she said, noticing him working. Turns out we can actually afford supplies when the money isn't being stolen. Keanu smiled. That's good. You deserve better tools. Riley set down the paint set she was holding and turned to look at him, really look at him. She had that expression on her face that suggested she was trying to solve a puzzle. You know, she said, I've been thinking about something since the story came out. Someone brought those documents to the journalist. Someone who worked here, who saw what was happening, who cared enough to do something about it. Keanu kept his expression neutral. A lot of people care about this place. Yeah, but not everyone would go that far, Riley said. Not everyone would risk their job, their reputation. To expose someone like Vincent, it takes a certain kind of person. The kind of person who sees something wrong and can't live with ignoring it. She paused. She was still looking at him, studying his face like she was trying to see something underneath the surface. When did you start? She asked. About 5 weeks ago, Keanu said. And you just happened to find all this evidence? In a month? I was paying attention, Keanu said. It was true. Riley turned back to her supplies. But he could tell she was still thinking. She was still trying to figure something out. And then, a few minutes later, she said something that made his chest tighten. There's something about your voice, she said quietly, and the way you move. And something about your eyes when you think nobody's looking. It's familiar. Keanu didn't respond. He just kept working on the shelves. Can I ask you something? Riley said, and I want you to be honest with me. Okay, Keanu said. Are you the one? Are you the person who brought the documents to Patricia? The room was very quiet. Outside, he could hear kids in the hallway, back to their programs now, back to feeling safe. He could hear the sounds of a place that was healing, and he could feel Riley waiting for an answer. He set down his tools and turned to face her. For the first time since he'd arrived at the center, he took off his baseball cap. He removed his glasses. He let her see his actual face, the one she'd seen in movies, the one she probably knew but had never quite placed because she'd been too focused on other things. Riley's mouth opened. She didn't say anything. She just stared. I received a letter, Keanu said, from someone who worked here. Someone who cared about this place and the kids in it. Someone who was scared and didn't know who to trust. So I came to see for myself. You're... Riley couldn't finish the sentence. I'm someone who saw a place doing important work being destroyed from the inside, and I couldn't walk away from that, Keanu said. I'm someone who watched you teach kids with almost nothing and watched the director steal from those same kids. I'm someone who saw a 9-year-old boy who needed help and couldn't get it because the money was gone. Riley sat down on one of the storage boxes. She looked like she might cry. You came here as a maintenance worker, she said. You didn't use your name. You didn't tell anyone. You just worked. I needed to see the truth, Keanu said. Not as a celebrity, not as someone with power and fame, just as another person in the building, paying attention. Why didn't you tell me? Riley asked. Because I needed to understand what you were really doing, what you actually cared about, without the distraction of knowing who I was. And I needed to see if the problems I suspected were real or if I was being paranoid. Keanu said, "They were real. So real that a kid got hurt and nobody could help him because the resources had been stolen." Riley was crying now. She wasn't crying because she'd met a famous actor. She was crying because someone had cared enough to sacrifice anonymity and ease to do something difficult and right. "What happens now?" she asked. Now you teach," Keanu said. "You teach those kids with the tools they deserve to have. You help them understand that they matter, that they can create beauty, that there are adults in the world who believe in them. That's what matters." Over the next few days, the news that it had been Keanu Reeves who brought the documents to the journalists spread through the center. It started with Riley telling other staff. Then it made its way to the parents, the kids, the community. But something interesting happened. People didn't treat him differently. He'd already proven himself to them by doing the work, by being present, by caring about something more than his own comfort. A few reporters tried to interview him, but he declined. He told them the story wasn't about him. The story was about corruption and recovery. The story was about a teacher who never gave up despite having almost nothing. The story was about a bookkeeper who finally found her voice. The story was about a community that was going to rebuild itself. One afternoon, Thomas came into the studio where Keanu was helping Riley set up new equipment. The black eye had faded. He looked brighter, lighter. Riley had told Keanu that Thomas was now working with a counselor, a position that had just been refunded by the board as part of their immediate changes. "Are you the guy who fixed everything?" Thomas asked. He was 9 years old, direct in the way kids are. "I just paid attention to what was happening," Keanu said. "Riley and Dorothy and other people did the real work." Thomas nodded like that made sense. "I have a counselor now. Her name is Helen, and she's nice. She helped me talk to my mom about my home stuff." He paused. "I'm making a sculpture about it." "That sounds good," Keanu said. "You want to see?" Thomas asked. So Keanu followed Thomas to his work area and looked at a clay sculpture that a 9-year-old boy had made. It was abstract, but it was powerful. It showed struggle and also hope. It showed a person learning how to carry something heavy. Looking at that sculpture, Keanu understood something he'd been trying to articulate all along. This was why he'd done it. Not for headlines or recognition. Not to be a hero, but because some things matter more than comfort. Some things matter more than staying invisible. Some things matter more than anything else. And sometimes the most powerful thing you could do is simply show up, pay attention, and care enough to act. The center was going to be okay. Thomas was going to be okay. And Keanu Reeves, who spent a month as nobody, had helped make sure that 0.6 months had passed since Vincent's arrest. The building looked the same on the outside, but inside, everything was different. The hallways felt lighter somehow. The programs were running again at full capacity. New equipment had been installed. The art studio had real shelves and proper storage. The pottery kiln from 1995 had been replaced with one that actually worked without breaking down every other week. Keanu still came to the center, but not as a maintenance worker anymore. That part of his life had ended when his real identity was revealed. Now he came as a volunteer, as someone who had decided that this place mattered enough to be part of his life in an ongoing way. He came on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when he didn't have filming obligations. Sometimes he fixed things because he still knew how. Sometimes he just listened to kids talk about their lives and their art and their dreams. The board had been completely restructured. They brought in people who actually understood nonprofit work, who had track records of transparency and accountability. Every financial document was now published online, where anyone could see where the money went. Every program had clear metrics for success. Every dollar was tracked and accounted for. It wasn't flashy or exciting, but it was honest. Dorothy had been given a raise and a promotion. She was now the finance director, with actual authority to oversee budgets and spending. She told Keanu one afternoon that she finally slept through the night, that the anxiety that had been living in her chest for years had finally loosened its grip. She was still the same quiet, steady person she'd always been, but now she had peace. Riley's art programs had expanded to 3 different community centers. She was training other teachers, sharing what she knew about how to reach kids who felt invisible or broken or like they didn't matter. She was still teaching pottery herself, still getting paint and clay under her fingernails, still creating spaces where kids could make something beautiful. But now she had the resources to do it the way she'd always dreamed. The youth counselor position had not only been restored but expanded. There were now 2 full-time counselors working with kids, helping them navigate trauma and family issues and the complicated mess of growing up without safety. Helen, the counselor who was working with Thomas, had become a cornerstone of the center. Kids trusted her. Parents sought her out. She was doing work that only existed because someone had cared enough to uncover the theft that made her position disappear in the first place. Thomas had turned 10. He was thriving. His grades had improved. He was attending school regularly. His home situation was still complicated because his mother was still working 2 jobs and his home environment was still difficult. But now he had a safe place to go. He had adults who believed in him. He had art as a way to process his feelings. He had a future that looked brighter than it would have looked if he'd never come to the center. One afternoon, a man named Robert came to see Keanu. Robert was a lawyer who specialized in nonprofit fraud cases. He wanted to talk about setting up a foundation that would help other community centers identify and prevent financial corruption. He wanted to use what had happened here as a blueprint for protecting other organizations. The thing about fraud and nonprofits, Robert explained, sitting in the center's new office that afternoon, is that it happens a lot, more than people realize. Good people working in these organizations know something is wrong, but they're afraid to say anything. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of going against authority. Dorothy was afraid, Keanu said. She knew something was wrong for years. Exactly, Robert said, and she wasn't alone. There are probably thousands of Dorothys in nonprofits right now, knowing something is off but not knowing what to do about it. If we could create a system where people had support, where they had someone to turn, where they knew they wouldn't lose everything for telling the truth, we could stop a lot of this. Keanu thought about that. He thought about how one letter from someone brave enough to reach out had changed everything. He thought about how many other organizations might have someone like Riley or Dorothy or Thomas inside them, suffering because someone like Vincent was stealing. Let's do it, he said. I'll help. Over the next month, Keanu and Robert set up a foundation. It provided grants to nonprofits for independent audits. It created a confidential hotline where employees could report concerns. It offered legal support to whistleblowers. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't make headlines. But it was the kind of work that prevented future Thomases from going without counselors. It was the kind of work that protected future Rileys from working without resources. One evening, there was a community celebration at the center, not a fancy event with important people giving speeches, just a gathering of the people who actually made the place work. Parents brought food. Kids showed their art. Staff talked about what they were doing. It was warm and real and honest. Thomas was there with his mother. She was tired, the kind of tired that comes from working hard and not making much money. But she was there, and she was proud. She stood in front of his clay sculpture, the one about struggle and hope, and she cried. He made this because of you people, she said to Riley, because you gave him a place where he could feel safe enough to work through his feelings. Riley hugged her. There was no performance in it, just 2 women, one who worked at the center and one who had a kid in it, acknowledging that something real and good was happening. Keanu stood at the edge of the room, watching. An older volunteer came up to him. Her name was Joseph, and he'd been coming to the center to help with maintenance for 20 years. You know what's crazy? Joseph said, I work here for 2 decades. I watch this place do good work. I never say anything about the problems I see. Then you show up for a month, you're nobody, and you change everything. I just couldn't ignore it, Keanu said. That's the thing, though, Joseph said. A lot of us could ignore it. We did ignore it, and you didn't. That matters. A year after Vincent's arrest, the center published its annual report. It was transparent in a way annual reports usually aren't. It showed the budget. It showed how many kids they served. It showed their success metrics. It showed where the fraud had happened and what changes they'd made to prevent it from happening again. It was honest. The report also included stories from the kids. Thomas's was in there. He'd written about how the center had saved his life. He'd written about having a counselor to talk to, about art as a way to heal, about learning that he mattered. He'd written about Keanu, though he didn't use his full name. He just called him the man who cared enough to notice. Keanu kept a copy of that report on his desk at home. Every time he looked at it, he remembered why he'd spent a month being invisible. Every time he saw Thomas's words, he understood that the real story wasn't about catching a bad guy. It was about protecting good people and the vulnerable kids they served. 2 years after the original story broke, the state attorney general's office used this case as a template for training nonprofit investigators. They brought in Riley and Dorothy to talk about what it was like to be inside a corrupt organization, what they'd noticed, why they were afraid, and what finally gave them courage. They brought in Keanu to talk about the importance of bearing witness, about how proximity creates responsibility. But the most important part happened quietly, with no cameras and no official recognition. Thomas turned 12. He was accepted into a special arts program at his middle school. He was talking about going to art school someday, about maybe becoming a teacher himself and helping other kids the way Riley had helped him. His mother had gotten a better job with more stable hours. She was still tired, but she was also hopeful. Helen, the counselor, had helped Thomas understand his home situation wasn't his fault. She'd helped him learn skills for managing his emotions. She'd helped him see a future where he could be okay even if his home was still complicated. And that future only existed because Keanu Reeves had decided that paying attention was a form of action. Late one afternoon, Keanu was sitting alone in the art studio when Riley came in. She had paint on her hands and a smudge of clay on her cheek. "I was thinking about something," she said, sitting down next to him. "When you first came here, I didn't know who you were. I just saw someone who cared enough to listen. Someone who was willing to do work nobody else wanted to do. Someone who was present. That's all I was," Keanu said. "Yeah, but that's everything," Riley said. "That's more important than being famous. That's more important than having power. Just being present. Just caring. Just doing the work." Keanu nodded. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, that the greatest impact doesn't come from grand gestures or celebrity. It comes from showing up. It comes from paying attention. It comes from caring enough to do something difficult even when nobody's watching. The sun was setting outside the studio windows. Kids were leaving for the day. Riley would stay late to clean up like she always did. Dorothy was upstairs finishing paperwork like she always did. And Keanu would help Riley close down the studio like he'd been doing for the past 2 years. This was the real story, not the scandal, not the arrest, not the headlines. The real story was this: a place that was healing, kids who were thriving, adults who were finally able to give what they'd always wanted to give, and a man who learned that the most powerful thing he could do was simply show up and care. And in the quiet, ordinary work of making that happen, everything changed.